Sorry, someone came to my house, and so you might hear some dog barking because we're eating a load of firewood. Anyway, so we had just found the paper that we were looking for. If you were just doing a general search and you're not looking for a specific paper, you can pick your date range here. If you just want new information, you can pick since 2016 or since 2019 if you want something super recent. So I could click on this link and it should take us to our paper of interest. And so here we have the title, the journal that it's in, and the authors. This tells us when it was published, and this gives us the DOI, so where we can access it. So if you're looking to make a citation for a work cited, this gives you all of the information that you need. Okay, so this paper, instead of calling it an abstract, they call it a summary. And there's a lot of things about this paper that make it much more approachable. So a summary and an abstract mean the same thing. They're always going to be the first thing that you see when you access a paper. A nice thing about this summary and sort of a aspect that makes it more better scientific communication is that it's broken up into these main points. So instead of reading a whole dense paragraph where you have to dissect the information and try to figure out what are the main points, it's broken up for us. So we can read this summary and get an idea of what the paper is about. So variation among species in their phenological responses. So we're thinking that word phenology, right? You might have to stop right here and Google, see if I can open one, the word phenology. Just do phenology definition, right? If you don't know what that word means. So phenology, the study of cyclic and seasonal natural phenomena, especially in relation to climate and plant and animal life. So remember, we learned about this in class, how phenology has to do with these periodic events in the lives of organisms. So variation among species in their phenological responses to temperature change suggests that shifts in the relative timing of key life cycle events between interacting species are likely to occur under climate warming. So it's saying that we are likely to get changes in phenology due to this temperature change. However, it remains difficult to predict the prevalence and magnitude of these shifts, given that there have been few comparisons of phenological sensitivities to temperature across interacting species. So that part of it sort of says, we don't really know what's going to happen because we don't have a lot of data for interactions between species, which, as we know, in an ecosystem, there's always interactions. And so there's no isolated system there. Point number 2, here we used broad scale approach utilizing collection records to compare the temperature sensitivity of the timing of adult flight in butterflies versus flowering of their potential nectar food plants. And that's across space and time in British Columbia, Canada. So we have a specific locality that this applies to, which is important because when you are drawing conclusions about this research, you want to know where it happened and how that climate might be different than the climate you might be trying to relate this information to. They also say collection records. So think about how an herbarium is a kind of catalog of collections of plants. So the same thing happens for animals, right? Where we would have these collections from throughout history of butterflies that we would be looking at, and those would have dates and information about how they were collected. Point 3, on average, the phenology of both butterflies and plants advanced in response to warmer temperatures. So advanced means happened earlier in the year. However, the two taxa were differentially sensitive to temperature across space versus across time, indicating the additional importance of non-temperature cues and or local adaptation for many species. So we are looking at two different groups of organisms, plants and butterflies, and how they're responding to these temperature changes. Now, these two things rely on each other, right? Butterflies are pollinators and plants are nectar providers. So the plants are providing nectar for the butterflies, a food source, and the butterflies help the plants reproduce. If those two things respond differentially to changes in time, then that could mean that their timing starts to stagger, where maybe they both come out earlier, but one comes out too early and they don't correspond anymore. If they responded the same and each of them just advanced at the same rate, then it wouldn't really cause a problem. However, if we see that difference between them, then that's going to mean that possibly their phenology doesn't align. Part 4, across butterfly plant associations, flowering time was significantly more sensitive to temperature than the timing of butterfly flight. And these sensitivities were not correlated. So we had plants being far more sensitive to temperature than the butterflies. And so what that tells us is that maybe plants are going to be fluctuating more each year, or that they are going to be advancing more rapidly than butterflies. That again is our sort of what that differential response is. And the fifth point, our results indicate that warming-driven shifts in the relative timing of life cycle events between butterflies and plants are likely to be prevalent, but that predicting the magnitude and direction of such changes in particular cases is going to require detailed fine-scale data. So usually in the abstract, you'll get the results. And here they've given us results as well as kind of the difficulty with using those results. So kind of the result of many scientific studies is that we need more data. We need more data to be able to draw these conclusions, and we just don't have that data right now. So it's encouraging other scientists to then go collect that data. So notice that reading that summary took me a long time. I had to take each piece of it, break it down, and translate it for myself. You should be doing the same thing. And if I were you, I would read the abstract or summary, and I would take notes either on the side or on a separate document where I wrote to myself, what were the main findings? Where did it take place? When did it take place? What was the study about? What organisms were involved? To try to organize that information for myself, because this is a summary of possibly years worth of research. So it's going to have a lot of information densely packed in there. And while this one is nicely broken apart and uses words that you can understand and conceptually is approachable, you'll get a lot of abstracts that are complex and not necessarily poorly written, but poorly written for communication with non-scientists or people outside of that particular scientific field. So that's the summary / abstract. Always start there and see if it's even talking about what you're actually studying, right? Okay, so we read that. Now, most scientific papers are going to have the same general structure. They have that abstract in the beginning, then they start with an introduction. This introduction is essential for you to read. It tells you about prior research that has gone into this topic, and that's what all these citations are different papers that they are building the information about this topic on. So an introduction often is a review of other literature that then sort of saves you from having to go read all of those papers. And it sets this research into context. So you should always read the introduction. Often I find that is the sort of most rich source of information within a paper. So this gives you the story about sort of what they're going to do and what work has been done on it before and why it matters. Materials and methods. This is super important if you are really analyzing a paper, trying to figure out what they did, and maybe you want to replicate it, or you want to see maybe what their study size was, how many butterflies did they use, what time period. All of that information is going to be in materials and methods. However, a lot of the time materials and methods is not even something you need to understand to look at what they did. If you want to draw conclusions about it and its importance, or really be able to say something about the conclusions, you would need to understand the materials and methods. But for your level in science, you don't. So I would recommend skipping over the materials and methods, because it'll kind of get you bogged down in all of the facts. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to read the Bible, but there's this part, like it starts out like a story and then it goes into like measurements of the Ark of the Covenant for a while. So it's kind of like that. Not that many of you would probably have read the Bible, but I tried to do it once just to see what it was all about. And I got bogged down in the materials and methods. Okay, so all of this is materials and methods. This data considerations part would explain kind of how they looked at their data and why. And then we get to the results. So notice this is in a different color, right? These are our headings. So we look at our results, and these are going to tell us what they found. And often we're going to have a lot of data. We'll have big tables. We'll have p-values, which tells us how kind of confident we can feel in our results, whether they statistically matter, which we can talk about later in the course if you want to. Just let me know. So the results often are also hard to digest because we get lots of statistical analyses, which if you don't know statistics or haven't taken statistics, or even if it's been a while, they can be hard to understand. The graphs that they present are often sort of this like glimmering hope of how to interpret this section. So you read the summary. Where is that? Way up here. And you read the introduction. We skipped over the materials and methods. We're going to kind of look at the results, look for things we can understand about them, but we can cruise over a lot of that too. A wonderful thing about scientific papers is the discussion. So this is sometimes also called the conclusion. They will take the results and state them in a interpretable way. So you take all of this data, all of these statistics, and you kind of convert them into words. So for people just starting to read scientific papers, I recommend you read the summary and the introduction, and then skip down to the discussion or conclusion to see how they interpreted their results. Down here, we have acknowledgements, data accessibility. So if we were to try to look at where their data came from and analyze it, then we could go to this. And you're actually going to look at the data that they used for this study. So that is kind of the basics of looking at a scientific paper and how to find one. But you definitely need to practice this yourself. And I don't recommend that people just skip large sections of a scientific paper once they get deeper into a field of science. But for our purposes early on, really you just need to read the summary, the introduction, and the discussions, and then look at some of the figures that are present in the results.